Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Say Again with me, Amrita Tripathi. I'm in conversation today with Astha Kapoor, the co founder and director of Aapti Institute, which looks to bridge tech and society. Astha, I was looking at the website, it says working at the intersection there to build solutions that enhance societal impact, justice, and equity. So I'd love to dive straight in. I'll be asking you more about Aapti Institute and your work there. But just to kick off, you were recently at the AI Summit in Paris, the Artificial Intelligence Action Summit that was co-chaired by Prime Minister Modi along with French President Emmanuel Macron. Can you take us through some of the key takeaways for you? What was interesting about the summit? What came out of it?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for having me. I think that just jumping right into the French AI Action Summit, it was interesting to me. It was my first time at one of these summits. There has been one in Bletchley Park in the UK 2 years ago, then there was one in Seoul, and now this was the third one. At Bletchley Park, the agenda was very much about like, oh, the future harms of AI. And I think the French did a really good job of bringing it to the here and now, because we have to live with these technologies today and not necessarily think about, oh, the robots are coming in the future, what are we going to do? So I think that one of the main sort of reframes of the French AI Summit was like, AI is now, and how do we think about it? There was also, very interestingly, a push for public interest AI, because I think that there has been a lot of conversation about how AI enhances efficiency, how all of the models that you and I have been using, whether it's ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever, is about individual um, usage of large language models. But there's obviously a huge body of work that is to be done about making public interest questions, whether it's access to health, better education, can we add greater efficiencies to social protection, how do we identify and reach people, etc. So there's a lot of use cases around that. And so the focus of the French was also on public interest AI. In terms of my takeaways, I think that the AI summit was happening, obviously, a few weeks into the change in presidency in the United States. So that was hanging pretty large in Paris, and also at the AI summit. I think that the other thing was the question of, some of what we've relied on in terms of institutional governance mechanisms, multi-stakeholderism, ideas of multilateralism, can we come and sort of crowd around this big question of AI governance, and can we do that together? That was also something that was looming, and I don't think that we talked about that we're actually likely seeing the end of multilateralism in a certain kind of way. What was also interesting, I think, from the European perspective, because that was obviously quite discussed, is that there is a general panic in the world about, what are we all as countries going to be able to build? Are we going to be competitive? Is, our markets just going to be flooded by goods and services that we have not necessarily built? And I think the European stance has been very much about, we need to think critically about innovation. We need to think about sovereignty in the context of innovation. We need to create European infrastructures for technology. They've been talking about the Euro stack. So I think that there is a lot of that panic in Europe in terms of, are we going to be competitive? Are we going to be able to innovate? Do we have the right amount of resources, talent, models, the works? And so on day one, Emmanuel Macron made this speech about that, this is the time for Europe, and we're going to come and build AI ecosystems. From the India perspective, even though we were co-chairs, I feel like we didn't get the appropriate space to chisel the agenda. I think that, while Prime Minister Modi spoke, and I have to say, in the middle of all of this chaos with Macron talking about, build, 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 and J.D. Vance, who's the Vice President of the United States, who also spoke on day two and talked about almost like, let's get rid of regulation. Regulation is not good for our companies. In the midst of all of this, I felt that Prime Minister Modi's speech was actually quite balanced. He talked about, risks from AI. He talked about the idea of rivalry and how we need to move beyond that. He talked about citizen centricity. He talked about making AI work for us versus the other way around. Like I said, like in the cacophony, Prime Minister Modi made a lot of sense. And the next AI summit is in India, so something for us to watch out for. But I was a bit disappointed, like with the depoliticization of the space. I think that we didn't talk enough about like I said, the politics of AI governance. What happens when you have, global power saying we don't want regulation? What happens where you actually have a major defunding of entities that actually look at governance? There was a lot of funder mobilizing. So a lot of philanthropists were also going into huddles to think about how they make up for some of the governance deficit in the context of AI. Um, and I think that the other issue I had is that we didn't deal enough with questions of, the power dynamic, that the AI landscape is actually in the hands of a few countries which
Yeah.
live in one country, and all of that. And so what is the sort of much more global, distributed, democratic position? I think India has an opportunity to frame some of that if we do a good job of the next AI summit, which is likely going to be Feb 2026, and the opportunity to take a leadership position. But we need to start making the right sounds now.
That's so interesting. And there's so many strands to what you said. Firstly, thank you for sharing that, like in a nutshell, what we would have missed. One thing that's really fascinating is this idea that it could go so differently if there was public interest based AI. I remember talking to Laurent Daudet, this sort of French author. Actually, they wrote this, he and Apopen have this graphic novel out called Dream Machine, which I highly recommend, where they're talking about some of the ethics, at play here when it comes to Gen AI and this quest to AGI. So I do want to ask you, and we just had Rishi Jaitley on, say again, talking about maybe reframing the narrative and stop looking at it as an arms race, which then pits every country against each other, every region against each other. I'd love to know your take on that. And also, we do have this sense that it's China and the US are the two main global players, as you were alluding to. Where does India or even Europe stand when it comes to that? Are you seeing that appetite, like you said, for India to take a leadership position? Europe also, actually, increasingly, we're seeing countries like France saying we need to have more sort of skin in the game.
So yes, there is an arms race, and it's been very, interestingly framed in that same Cold War kind of language, right? And we know how that turned out. So there's some lessons from the past. But I think that there's also a burgeoning sort of like non-aligned movement, if I had to lean into the same kind of analogies, which is that we don't want American big tech, which is totally devoid of governance. We obviously don't want Chinese technology companies because they come with their own baggage on surveillance and state power. Is there a third way? I think that Europe is thinking about it as well, and India, because just off the G20 presidency, we did talk a lot about digital public infrastructure. It's public in its purpose, it's public in its openness, and is that the third way? I don't fully know if we have a hold on what that looks like in the context of AI. I don't think that we've done a good enough job as a country to define a position. And this is what I've been talking about in a lot of circles. It's like we need to take a stance as India. Like, what do we stand for in the context of AI, right? We are going to be a huge market for these technology companies. There's a reason that people like Sam Altman keep coming through the doors of India, because we're a huge market for any kind of software. There have also been conversations about, should we be building models, or should we be just much more upstream building applications on models, which maybe I'm not a technologist, I don't fully understand the implications, but I do know that we need to think much more critically about our position and how we frame that. I also know that some of these large language models do not work for us, right? The information that goes into it is not representative. Our data is not in it. Therefore, the results that we're getting back are not necessarily meant for us. And this has been a general conversation around like whether technology is contextualized or is it just meant for white men. And I'm sure everybody's read, The Invisible Women, which is like crash test dummies are, tested on a 6'1" white male guy, which is why women die more during accidents, right? So I think it's a little bit of that again, which is that what are we encoding into the models, and whether there's going to be a much more sort of contextual build that's going to come out of it. Are we going to be the people to lead that? Are we also going to move away from these enormous models to much more contextual models and what those might look like? There's also a huge question about energy, right? We are not energy self-sufficient. We're not one of those countries. We rely on oil from other parts of the world. What does that mean as we start to think about setting up, data processing center? Where is the power going to come from? What is that going to cost us? So I think that we have a bunch of big questions to answer, but my view is that we need to do this quickly, because right now there's a little crack in the politics of the world to take positions, given that the Trump presidency has come and shaken a lot of power dynamics. I think that we need to think much more about public interest, citizen centricity, more contextual models, environmental impact, and we need to do that soon.
It's interesting. I mean, I definitely think that there's so many strands again to pick up from that. That should be its own mini series, Astha. But let me ask you, specifically at Aapti, your latest newsletter talks about building a gender-friendly AI, and you brought up Invisible Women. That's such a fantastic book and really enraging on many levels. But take us, and we'll link to your newsletter in the show notes actually,
Yes.
so people can take a look at it. But take us through some of the thought process here. We've heard, in the early stages, I would say, like probably last year, about this gender bias when it comes to and people have noted this, right, whether it's ChatGPT and stuff, and they've quickly been talking about reprogramming LLMs and so on. But when you talk about building a gender friendly AI from the ground up, and of course for India there's a lot of push now on sort of Indian languages as well, can you take us through a little bit of the highlights there?
Yeah, I think that we have seen, and that we have a report out with the UNTP also on gender and AI, and there's other work that's also happening in the ecosystem about gender risks. And I think that we are seeing that both the data that goes into building models, and therefore the this sort of material that comes out of models is problematic for non-cis males, even in the context of India, right? We There's obviously bias, there's the intersection of gender and deep fakes, there's sexual abuse, there's sexualized content, and we don't even have to go so far up the tech chain. We've been doing a lot of work on how women trust digital platforms, and we realize that actually they're just made as there's this like misunderstanding that technology is gender neutral. It's absolutely not. What women desire from tech is very different from what men desire from tech. And I think what we are missing in that context is the fact that women are not able to easily adopt technologies, that there are breakdowns, that also the lived experiences of women are not captured by technology. So some of the work that we've done on the idea of trust in tech, women usually use shared phones, right? So even in the context of agentic AI, like if you're using your brother's phone, what are you receiving at the end is going to be very different from what your brother, who's obviously spending more time. So in India, I think that the lived experiences of women is not accommodated in technology, to my mind. And seeing that we don't understand this, but of course fraudsters and scamsters, which is obviously so abundant right now and all of us are suffering, they actually have very different playbooks for men and women from what we understand, which is that the way that they sort of use to trap men is very different from like the love scams that women fall prey to. Because while technology is not built for agency for women, it is often used to like remove agency from women. And I think that within that there's a huge problem, and these are biases, these are deficits that are also represented in the way AI. And again, like I have to say this, like AI is, the way you and I are talking about it right now, is large language models, but there's obviously a huge history of like, so I think there's also some unbundling to be done on what is AI. But in this context, large language models are obviously fraught with biases.
So I do want to, and of course, to flag, as we've been seeing, there's a lot of seniors falling prey to like deep fakes and stuff that you're talking about. So we do have this sort of, the need to also educate constantly, I think, folks about what some of the loopholes are. I'm going to ask you, something you're keeping an eye out, but also what's your most controversial opinion? This is where you give me the headline bite. Where do you think, you as someone who's in this policy space and watching things closely, maybe you can give us a scenario, like a sort of, mild to extreme, if you like, on the spectrum of and from India's point of view, I think, because I think there's a lot going on, and as you said, that sort of the geopolitics of it is really wrapped up in this as well.
So, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about like what are the likeness, like, how do we govern AI, right? Like, and I think that the issue that all of us are having who work on this is that this is unlike anything else. You could govern, say, road safety because, you could just go to the car manufacturers and say, let's put a seatbelt on it. Right? You could govern nuclear proliferation in a certain way and say you were going to use it for energy, but not for war. And there were ways in which you could govern traditional almost infrastructure. Road safety is a traditional, road is a traditional infrastructure, nuclear power plants as traditional infrastructures, and you could govern it because they were in very many ways centralized. AI is obviously so diffuse that anybody with a laptop and a reasonable gaming GPU could build models and code and come out with things. So I think that that's where we've been kind of stuck. But my brain keeps going to non-proliferation, which is that how do we create clear globally agreed upon boundaries of where it's okay to use artificial intelligence technologies and where it's not. So can we come to some kind of consensus to say, hey, it's not okay? And you have some of this on child pornography at the global governance level, etc., which is like, hey, it's not okay to use artificial intelligence for defense purposes, but it is okay to use it for research on pharmaceuticals, for instance. So I think that that's something that we've been playing around with, but it's not a fully baked thought. It's also not that controversial because it has been kicked around a little bit, but to take that non-proliferation to the next level, we've been thinking a lot about participatory AI. And on the sidelines of the Paris AI Summit, along with two organizations connected by data and Data in Society, we co-organized a participatory AI research symposium, which we hope we will do again in India. And one of the presentations there was about resistance as participation, which is that you just opt out to the extent that's possible. You document the ways in which AI technologies are, and the presenter said, ruining our cognitive infrastructure, which is our brains, our minds, and putting lines through our cognitive infrastructure and telling us things that we don't necessarily. There's a standardization, right? You put in a question about something and I put in the question about something, and that messiness of human interaction as it would have between you and I is not there because there's a standardization. So how do we create messiness, and how do we create resistances, and how do we participate in the process of AI is something that we've been talking also about, and maybe that's something to pursue.
That's interesting. I think that also this, these now starting to read these articles about, like you said, I mean, use of sort of Gen AI leading to a cognitive decline, like something in the papers recently, wasn't it? Papers just dates me. I know no one's reading the papers anymore, except me and the small group of this Gaulish village, I suppose. Speaking of resistance, I do want to ask you, a little bit about your own journey. And, for those of you who've been watching or listening, say again, we love to talk to people about their domain expertise and then, do a little bit of the behind the scenes. So Astha, we probably met, I think it was about 10 odd years ago, stint in like sort of the development sector and getting to see your interest in public health at that time. And again, I think social justice, equity, these were all very important areas for you. Can you take us through a little bit of like what has your trajectory been in setting up and co-founding Aapti, and a little bit about your journey then?
Yeah. So Aapti, as you mentioned, I co-founded with my co-founder, Sarayu Natarajan. And we met in Bangalore through a common friend. And it's because Sarayu always says we were bothering the same person with the same questions. And he said, like, why don't you talk to each other? So Sarayu already had registered an entity called Aapti. And I think that we just met at the right time and very quickly decided to tie our fortunes together. And the reason for that was that we were both lamenting in 2018 what was going to be the social impact of tech. I had just moved to Bangalore. She was doing her PhD coursework here, and I think in a very weird way asking the same questions. I think she was on the ground doing her field research in 2014. I had been also in the field doing like Aadhaar enrollments and things like that as part of my work. And the questions that we arrived at is like, he's saying build and there are efficiencies around this and all of that. But what happens to the people? Because the regulation conversations were going, the tech conversations were going, but the social impact was not necessarily being considered. And it was with that in mind that we decided to sort of do Aapti together. My own journey has been, maybe there's a thread in it, but I'm not fully sure if I found it yet. But I started work at the Planning Commission, which is now Niti Aayog, and I was working on the 12th five-year plan, which now I realize is the last ever five-year plan. And even during that time, what we did is that we tried to make the plan process more consultative, because up until now, up until the 11th five-year plan, every 5 years, somebody would say, hey, we need a five-year plan. And then, a bunch of smart people would get in a room and write it, and it all worked out. But then we were there, and Montek Singh had started a young professional program, and Saida Hamid, who was, sort of leading the charge with civil society organizations, was like, no, we need to open this stuff up. And so I helped a bunch of people organize these enormous consultations for the 12th five-year plan. And I think in that process, I understood the value of like participatory governance. I was 23, so didn't fully understand it. But I think now looking back, there was value in that. I also worked with Dalberg, which is a development consulting firm, interestingly, at a time where digitization of payments was a big thing. So USAID, the much maligned now USAID, had a partnership with the government of India at the time on digital payments. And Dalberg was the organization that was, sort of helping think through some of those questions. And I think I always say I was in the room when Nandan Nilekani first demonstrated Aadhaar in 2010. Like, I had box seats to what was going to be now we know as digital public infrastructure. And it's just stayed with me as a problem. We've been picking at it for the last now 15 years, I guess, and seeing what a transformation it's been. I also work with Self-Employed Women's Association briefly on a pilot on universal basic income, and this was 2012-13. Used to take money in bags to people to distribute it. So, India's come such a long way, and I've had the great privilege of being able to see some of this fairly up and close. And now, we sit here in 25 talking about AI, and we shouldn't forget that we just literally, like, right now, in your and my lifetime, managed to get people bank accounts. So, yeah.
That is incredible, and quite a journey that, as you're tracking the the trajectory for the country as well. I do want to ask you, in terms of your career, or it could be otherwise as well, where you are today, is there a change in how you look at success or failure? I mean, of course, being a founder, it's its own set of challenges and stress. We know that founder stress is a very real thing. So, hats off to you and your co-founders. But do you look at success and failure differently than you would have, say, at 23 back in the day?
Yeah, I think that at 23 it was, I mean, you know this because everyone who's been 23 knows that, you want to shake up the world, you want to change it and all of that. And again, this is what my co-founder always says is like surviving is that radical act of politics. And so now we're just thinking of like, what we do is important. How do we find the resources, the strength to keep doing it? So I think that it becomes tempered a little bit more in terms of like, it's not me, I'm not the agent of change, but I can create an institution where we could have people. And one of the things that I think a lot about is like, how do we create a cadre of young women who are interested in technology and asking the right questions, and very much creating a workspace that is not toxic, that is supportive, that doesn't steal your work, doesn't steal your voice. And so I think like really just thinking about what we can create much more as an institution that straddles a real kind of value system versus, I'm going to eradicate poverty or whatever else I wanted to do at 23.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's true. And then institution building is a tough thing. It's an important thing, but it is a tough thing, especially when it's value based. Just a couple more questions for you, Astha. So one is, I'd love to know what keeps you up at night. Is it something like the singularity is near, and when AGI, when sentience comes, we're toast, or what stresses you out?
Climate, like, I mean, again, like I've been living in Bangalore for the last 6 years. I can eyeball the difference in temperatures. I have a kid, like, it's just not a fun thought to think about in terms of what is the planet that we leave behind. And that has become a very, very real concern for me personally. And I think that we're not doing enough at all at the government level. Like, we're just like, anybody who's been in Bangalore will know that like that road between the golf course and the airport used to be green even like 5 years ago. The amount of like wanton like construction and the fact that we have been so disorganized, Delhi is obviously the case. And then of course the climate impact on the workers and children, and like the fact that we're just not thinking critically about it. So much more than the tech dystopia, like, which is also real, it's the climate dystopia. And I think both of those are linked. And just a little bit of work that we're doing on this is about like how can we think about women's collectives, and that are now starting to pool data for climate action, and how can we maybe bring in the gender plus data rights plus climate action questions together. So yeah.
Picking the small problems, aren't you? Right? Course, take just the easy stuff to solve for.
Yeah.
Is there anything you're watching or reading that you'd like to recommend?
On this climate stuff, and this is absolutely, these are the kinds of books that get you into trouble. But there is a environmentalist. His name is Andreas Mann, and he wrote a book, I want to say in 2020, called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. He's been in my head. I heard it at a completely wrong time, which has like fed my climate panic and also my anger and on the inaction and everything. But I would recommend it as a reading if you wanted to have an outlet for your anger. It is a very different take on climate activism, and some people would say it justifies violence. But I think that, the water's reached up to our ears. I think we need to do something about it. And, how to blow up a pipeline is one way of thinking about it. But yeah, it's an interesting book. I think gives you a lot to think about.
Okay, interesting. Before anyone sues us, our public position, though, and personal position, violence is never the answer, including for Astha.
No.
Legal disclaimer here, insert.
Yeah.
And final thoughts for you in terms of, sometimes it is nice to think about things we're grateful for, things that are going right. Any thoughts in terms of shout outs or gratitude that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think just in my Aapti life to my co-founder, I guess the ease, the wonder, the bonhomie of working with women. And I mean, I had to be 30-something-year-old and like meet a partner and really, really realize that working with women, for women, employing women, like all of that can be such a wonderfully magical thing. And so I think, and that's what Saryu and I always talk about, is like, it just makes life so much easier to come to work with women. So that.
I love that. Thank you so much, Astha, for taking the time and for sharing that. For our viewers and listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. We're going to be sharing, of course, some of the resources mentioned in this, and we'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.